The evolution of art from a Western perspective. According to that great source of knowledge, Wikipedia, the Western canon is the body of high culture literature, music, philosophy, and works of art that are highly valued in the West, works that have achieved the status of classics. Really, the Western canon is not such an immutable thing. It's more like a discussion of what best represents Western culture. The heart of the canon is pretty much stable, with celebrity artworks that Westerners recognize as familiar because Western education is built upon the canon. But this grand narrative of Western culture fluctuates a bit, with some artists being posthumously included, or the later inclusion of marginalized women and artists of color. We'll circle around to that much later, but right now, we're just going to cover some conventional ideas regarding the Western canon. So, the Western canon is rooted in Judeo-Christian ideas of a creator God, that there is a source, an author, who is the authority of the meaning of things. That creator creates a thing, a painting, a novel, a theory, and communicates a message which is then received by an audience. If you think back to the encoding, decoding reading, Stuart Hall writes about the model of a message, sender, receiver. It's a linear model. There's an origin with a message, and then the message is received by the audience. The origin is important. In the case of Roland Barthes, the author is the origin, and the author has authority. So, with the idea of a Western canon comes a sense of authorities or experts or judges who decide what gets included or excluded from the Western canon. And there are books and museums and schools that perpetuate the idea that certain literature or works of art are classics. These classics communicate and preserve Western culture. And like I said, Western culture builds off of a specifically Jewish/Christian understanding of history, a history which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So Western culture basically traces its beginning to Greek culture. And if you think about it, a lot of liberal arts studies found themselves upon the philosophical trinity of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And Alexander the Great, who had Aristotle as his private tutor, ended up establishing one of the largest empires of the ancient world with the express purpose of spreading Greek culture. Even in the Alexandrian libraries, scholars had a term, oi includentes, or the included, or the admitted, the actual papyrus scrolls that were included in the Greek canon. This is the same sort of system that the Western canon builds off of. So, to put this in concrete terms, who are the artists and authors that are included in the Western canon? Typically, you can think of Dante, Geoffrey Chaucer, Miguel de Cervantes, William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Ludwig van Beethoven, Mozart, Jacques-Louis David, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, Jan van Eyck. You get the picture. But what do these artists from different countries and times have in common? Western culture. And while this is a super generalized, ambiguous term, you can associate it with things like Judeo-Christian religion, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Age of Discovery, which, FYI, is hand in hand with colonialism, Romanticism, and eventually democracy and the Industrial Revolution, and all those other things that you learn about in history class. So when we talk about the Western canon, we are talking about this kind of progression of art, or a story of Western culture with roots in Greco-Roman culture. And when we focus on art between the Renaissance era and the mid-1800s, there are some visual characteristics that are prominent. For example, when we look at Fra Filippo Lippi's The Annunciation, we immediately see this is a representational painting. The people look like people, the flowers like flowers, the clothes like clothes. And keep in mind, this art is coming out of a long period where artists were not trying to be representational. Prior to the Western concept of art, art objects often functioned as religious objects. These kind of works weren't supposed to represent the world. They had a spiritual purpose. The Woman of Willendorf, for example, wasn't a sculpture that was supposed to accurately represent a woman, nor even be put on display. It was meant to be a talisman for fertility. You hold it in your hand, you keep it in your home, to physically and ritualistically access childbirthing abilities. These ancient figures, which were found beneath the floor of a temple in which is now Iraq, were not meant to be put on display. They were under the floor. They acted as human stand-ins to worship the god Abu when no people were present. And even into medieval European art, the focus was less on portraying things naturalistically and more on portraying things spiritually. Backgrounds are gold, real gold, symbolizing the majesty and otherworldly riches of heaven. Perspective, the way an artist accounts for space within the image, isn't really a thing. If you look at the figure on the far left, his red foot is not set firmly on the ground. The figures almost are floating in air. If this were naturalistic, in other words, accurately representing the natural world, the angel's wings would not be aligned in such a flat way. The wings don't even look like they are attached to the angels' bodies. Or if we look at this Madonna and Child icon, the faces are stylized because Mary and Jesus are not specific people to be accurately rendered, but eternal figures to be revered. Jesus looks like a creepy little man because medieval artists wanted to communicate the unchangingness of God. Jesus is forever a human at all stages of life, from childhood to adulthood. And his hands symbolize the Trinity, 3 fingers down, and the dual nature of his incarnation, 2 fingers up, representing both God and man. An underlying sentiment of medieval times was that this world would pass away, so we should focus on the eternal, and that's what this image stresses. But skipping over a lot of details, European art begins to change with the discovery of ancient texts and sculptures. There's a rebirth of the Greco-Roman culture's interest in the natural world. During the Renaissance, artists strive to incorporate naturalism into their works. So looking at the Annunciation, we see a linear perspective where the architecture is trying to account for real spatial depth. The lighting imitates natural lighting with a light source that comes from one direction and reveals the forms of accurate 3-dimensional things. Here are a few other things to note. The subject is still religious. Mary is getting some mind-blowing news from the angel Gabriel, but the form of the painting is earthly. It takes place in the here and now. The clothes, the building, the floor panels, they're all contemporary 1400s Italian fashion. Also, there's this new concept that is developed during the Renaissance, which is the concept of the window into another world. You, the viewer, are supposed to stand in the center of the painting. The perspective caters to you. All lines converge in the center. The frame is a border between our world and the world of the painting. The painting provides a view into another world that has the same nature as our own. Lighting, space, volume, color. It is the illusion of another world. And one last thing. The art wooden support this is painted on was originally part of the Palazzo Medici in Florence, Italy. It was later removed to the National Gallery in London, but the work itself is for a specific place to be experienced in a specific environment. Or, as John Berger put it in Ways of Seeing, the work is meant to be unique to its environment. Unlike this painting by Raphael, this is an easel painting. It's an object that can be bought and sold, and, true to the Western Canon, this painting is representational. It's an accurate depiction of Baldassare Castiglione. The proportions are correct. The lighting molds his characteristics and shows us the texture of his clothes, skin, and even the glassiness of his eyeballs. It's a window into another world. But it's also important to recognize this is an object. Castiglione commissioned Raphael to paint his portrait as a kind of trophy. Castiglione was the quintessential Renaissance gentleman. He was wealthy, well-educated, well-cultured, fashionable. The painting itself is not unique to a place, but it is a unique thing that captures the visual likeness of a man. Other artists who are representative of the Western Canon during the 1400s and 1500s include Caravaggio, who is a master of capturing light on form in a naturalistic way, and often depicted religious or mythological stories. Of course, there's also Leonardo da Vinci, who was constantly studying the natural world, from the way water flowed and birds flew to the human anatomy. Okay, so now we're going to skip ahead a few hundred years. This is Eugene Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. It depicts a French revolt against the then King Charles X. It's representational, with accurate depictions of the human body, and borrowing from Greco-Roman culture, Delacroix morphs a goddess figure into the personification of liberty, who rallies the French people. The content replaces religion with political ideology, which, in a way, acts as a religious stand-in. The form is chaotic, with bodies, flags, and weaponry creating implied lines that jut out all over the place. Yet the central figure, Lady Liberty, grounds the composition in a triangular shape with a cloud vignette that reinforces the entire composition. Again, this is another painting that upholds the Western canon because it's representative of the story of Western art and history. But then something crazy happens. In the mid-1800s, photography comes to the scene. At first, it doesn't really know what to do with itself. Photography mimics painting. There's a rectangular shape that functions as a window into another world with a perspective that centers on the viewer. The subject, form, and content are an extension of the Western canon of painting. Photography doesn't really develop its own identity as like this separate art form until later on. But the effect photography has on painting is really drastic. Artists, freed from the need to accurately represent the world, begin experimenting in new ways. While there's no immediate breakaway from representational subjects, in other words, painters are still painting trees and people and fruit and stuff, they're doing so in a way that engages the actual gooey paint in the canvas like never before. Instead of figuring out how to best use the medium, whether it be paint or bronze or stone, to render an accurate likeness of their subject, artists realize that photography can do that. They can now experiment with their medium and all of its qualities. So, looking at David by Michelangelo, definitely pre-photography. One of the intentions of Michelangelo is to produce a well-crafted human figure that celebrates the glory of being human. The medium is submissive to the human figure. But when we look at this sculpture by Auguste Rodin, which is post-photography, we see that the medium itself, the textural undulations of bronze, the lumps and crevices, they're all important. The way the figure is rendered is just as important as the figure itself. Of course, there are other aspects of history and circumstance that play into why Rodin chose to sculpt in this way, but right now we're just focusing on photography. Here's another good example of how photography changes the medium. This water lily painting by Claude Monet is obviously representational, but it's abstracted. One of Monet's intentions is to highlight the medium. He lays down one gooey color next to another so that our eyes have to do the mixing. He could painstakingly mix just the right color to capture just the right reflection in the water, but that's not what he wants to do. He wants to experiment with the medium. He wants to push the paint's potential. The brushstrokes are thick and create a blurred texture because he's interested not in just copying nature, but in creating a work of art unto itself with all of its painterly qualities. Also, look at the perspective. Previously, painting centered the window into another world upon the viewer, who stands in front of the window and sees the space of the other world converging into the distance and opening up into the viewer's space. But once photography comes around, a photographer can carry a camera anywhere. They can point the lens up, down, to the side, and get all sorts of odd angles. And with that, a perspective that centers upon a static viewer dissipates. So looking at Monet's water lilies, there's still a sense of spatial depth, but the viewer is looking down into the pond. That window that separates the viewer from the depicted world starts to encompass the viewer because there is no longer a central viewing point. The image is part of a larger environment that can be viewed from many different angles, and the viewer must maneuver and account for that decentralized viewing experience. Here's another post-photography painting by Paul Cézanne. It is a finished painting. Cézanne's intentions have been fulfilled. It looks unfinished by our standards, but what Cézanne wants to communicate is the actual painting as an object. And here's what I mean. We recognize the still life. It's a representational painting. It still functions as a window into another world, but that world is starting to break down. We can't just look at the image without taking into account how it is made. Cézanne is forcing us to pay attention to the actual paint and canvas. He even leaves some of the canvas unpainted because we have to realize that this is an object that has been created, not just an image that mimics the natural world. Also, the perspective is really wonky. It looks like the whole table is going to spill out into our space. Cézanne is breaking all the rules intentionally because photography can do everything that painting was supposed to do in the past. This is a new direction for painting. The viewer has to come to grips with the fact that the other world beyond the window is an illusion, and Cézanne is rupturing that illusion and making paintings that are obviously paint on canvas, not a depiction of a world that's like our own. The subject is subservient to the medium, the form. The painting is less about the still life and more about how the still life is painted. Okay, so there are other crazy things going on in the late 1800s / early 1900s. The printing press is in full swing. I mean, it's not like books and newspapers weren't around before this time. I mean, the printing press was invented in the 1400s. But by the 1800s, printed matter is prevalent, global, and cheap. So even if you can't afford to travel, you can afford to know about other cultures through print. And at this time, Europe is going through this Oriental craze. Yeah, totally not an acceptable term for the present, but this phase is literally called Orientalism in academic studies. So basically, it's a whole bunch of Westerners who think of other cultures as exotic and good-looking, particularly the cultures of the East. And then imitation of other cultures becomes all the rage in the West. So you have Vincent van Gogh, for example, appropriating imagery from French publications on Japanese culture. Also at this time, colonialism is rampant. So there's this idea that other countries, now that they're colonies of the British, French, Spanish, or Netherlandish kingdoms, have customs, wealth, and art forms that can be added to the Western mix. And don't get me wrong, of course, the West looked down upon colonial territories as lesser than, but that didn't stop the West from romanticizing and objectifying what they referred to as primitive. At the same time, there's a huge missionary expansion from the West, meaning ultimately cultures are meshing with each other to a degree that hadn't been possible before the steamship and locomotive technologies of the 1800s. So, of course, this affects the Western canon. Western artists, are intrigued by non-Western aesthetics. Paul Gauguin, a contemporary of Vincent van Gogh, ends up moving to Tahiti and developing a style that draws from Tahitian culture. He intentionally adopts a primitivist paring down of shapes and figures. And I stress the word primitivist. Again, the West saw itself as civilized. Indigenous cultures were not civilized. They were primitive, hence primitivism. And this is a term for the art that is of this style. You can also think about it along these lines. Primitivism was a way for Westerners, or in this case Gauguin, to return to his inner noble savage. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau espoused this idea that society corrupted humanity's basic inherent goodness. We are born, in our primitive state, good. Only after we are exposed to social pressures do we become bad, greedy, envious, and quote-unquote civilized. If artists could escape the constraints of Western civilization and immerse themselves in a primitive way of life, they could become noble again, basically capitalized off colonialism to somehow become noble savages, seeing themselves as cultural mediaries who appropriated indigenous styles to then sell back to wealthy European collectors. I mean, the paintings themselves are good enough to eventually be included in the Western canon, but you have to account for all angles. Actually, there was even a brief period, a brief movement called Fauvism, which translates to wild beasts in French. Gauguin's art was a strong influence on this group, which used bright colors and sketchy brushwork to break away from the Western tradition, basically for the artist to become one with their inner noble savage. Okay, so now I want to use Pablo Picasso's career as a summary of all this stuff. Early on, Picasso made realistic paintings. He painted in the way European academies of art taught to establish a firm foundation in the Western canon. So there would be a lot of observational drawing, meaning students would look at stuff in the real world and accurately render it on a piece of paper, on canvas, or in clay, or whatever. It was important that students understand all the rules of the Western canon. So, at age 15, Picasso pulls off this painting, a realistic portrayal of a sickbed scene with correct proportions, realistic lighting, good painting technique that captures textures, etc. But then Picasso leaves academic studies and hangs out with all the cool kids at bars and cafes. And he gets introduced to the work of the Impressionists and Van Gogh and Matisse and Edvard Munch. And in 1901, he paints this painting, which is a portrait of his friend who committed suicide after a breakup. But you can see that it's a big departure from the realistic stuff he was doing early on. And obviously, works like this by Vincent van Gogh would have been a huge influence. Anyways, in 1906, as the myth goes, Picasso is roaming the streets of Paris, because that's what bored artists do, and winds up in the Ethnographic Museum of Trocadero. Keep in mind, France was the ruling power in a large part of Western Africa. A consequence of French colonialism was that African masks ended up in this museum in Paris, and this would be the type of mask that the museum would have collected. So bored Picasso sees them on a display and then starts adopting the style into his paintings. And at first it's kind of subtle, like this portrait of Gertrude Stein. But then, the following year, he paints Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and it's fugly, like intentionally fugly. The demoiselles were prostitutes that worked in Paris's red light district. Their bodies are split into uncomfortable planes. One of the women straight up has her legs open to the viewer. They stare back at us, like with wide-angled eyes, acknowledging that we are looking at them, and they don't care. Artists and critics of the time thought this painting was atrocious. It totally didn't mesh with the Western canon, which was supposed to be this positive narrative of Western art that excluded fugliness such as this. And this is where I'm going to digress for a second. Right now, we're in 1906. We're going to go back to 1863 for a second. So if you were a legit artist, you were supposed to go to one of the European academies of art and learn the proper way to paint, the Western canon way. And there was this massive yearly exhibition called the Paris Salon, or the Parisian Salon, where only the best artists could exhibit their work. And a lot of artists got rejected. This is an image of what the salon would have looked like and what kind of painting would have been selected. So in 1863, there were so many artists who made controversial artworks. In other words, works that did not get accepted into the salon by authorities who were the key holders to the Western canon, so that a salon des refusés, a salon of the rejected, basically, got established. These are some of the works that, at the time, were rejected from the Western canon, but later, after a lot of art history books were written and the salon eventually went defunct, these are the works that became the poster children of the Western canon. And that's where we get the idea of the avant-garde. The term is a military one, meaning advance guard, and where we get the word vanguard, like advance, vanguard. Avant-garde art was art that didn't adhere to the Academy's strict rules that supposedly preserved the best of Western culture. A lot of artists saw the Academy as stale, formulaic, and conventional. They wanted their art to be taken seriously, so they still submitted their works to the Salon because that was the way to solidify your career. But avant-garde artists also saw themselves as agents of cultural change and advancement. Their work was supposed to push the boundaries of convention. In the mid to late 1800s, there were too many artists who realized the Academy and the Salon just weren't in tune with the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. And that's what ultimately led to the decline of the European art academies and the Salon. So, back to Picasso, that avant-garde artist. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was a piece that was slightly ahead of its time. It wasn't trying to put a beautiful woman on display for art viewers to appreciate. The work was trying to challenge social norms. It was trying to make viewers feel uncomfortable. So let's keep moving with Picasso. He's probably the most well-known for the development of Cubism, which, to be honest, other artists were doing at the same time, but somehow Picasso suckered his way to the forefront, so we credit Cubism to him. Anyhow, yes, Picasso is experimenting with what can happen on the picture plane. And remember, photography can record an accurate likeness, so artists can do other things with their medium. And yes, his run-in with African masks were super influential. But there are some other things that also factor into Cubism. Enter Albert Einstein. And no, I'm not going to explain the nitty-gritty of the theory of relativity, but I am going to touch on it because this is the early 1900s. There are technological inventions that alter a human's experience of the world. And yes, we've always walked around and experienced motion at that speed, but now we have bikes and trains and air balloons and even cars, and a little bit later, airplanes. And our bodies interact with space and time in a new way. So, if you think about two people passing each other in a car, you see each other from far away, and then you rapidly get closer. And then for a brief second, you're side by side, and then you're behind one another. You become very aware that your positions quickly change as you quickly traverse space. Both of you are changing spatial and temporal relationships in relation to one another. This is an example of the theory of relativity in practice. Our bodies occupy space and time is in constant flux. Everything is relative or contingent upon continual movement through space and through time. And since the world is always moving, everything is always relative to some body of mass somewhere at some point in time. All right. So how does this relate to cubism? Imagine a glass bottle sitting on a table in front of you. You can move around the bottle and see it from different angles. Or you can turn the bottle and see all of its three-dimensionality from where you are because you're moving the bottle. Now, if you take a hammer and smash the glass bottle and then lay it out on the table, you can see all parts of the bottle, front, back, top, bottom, whatever, at the same time. Basically, you are collapsing the bottle's mass, or its three-dimensionality, into a single two-dimensional experience. You no longer have to turn the bottle to the other side, which would be the movement of mass through time and space, because now the whole bottle is splayed out on a single plane. And that's what cubism does. It takes account of the world, its volume as it occupies space and time, and breaks it apart on the two-dimensional surface of the canvas so you can see the whole bottle, or in this case, the whole person, all at once. And in this way, cubism is addressing the spirit of the times, the zeitgeist. All the crazy scientific and technological discoveries that are happening in the early 1900s are made visible in cubism. But remember, it's still representational. In other words, this is a painting of a person, not a painting of shapes or lines. Cubism still represents the natural world. Only the form takes precedence. The form is more important than the subject. So, just to prove a point, early 18th century artists seem to be obsessed with motion. In Italy, artists formed the Futurist movement. Painters and sculptors try to capture time and space on a static, two-dimensional canvas. I mean, look at these titles: Dynamism of a Car, Speeding Automobile, or in the case of the human body, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. Seriously, who titles a sculpture Unique Forms of Continuity in Space? Obviously, a motion junkie. Anyways, there's another thing that sprouts up around this time: the moving image. Over a series of years throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the movie camera is invented. Thomas Eakins, a well-established American painter, uses photography to study the body in motion, and artists like Marcel Duchamp, who you might recognize from The Fountain, try to capture this kind of progression of movement on the canvas. But a few years before this, a Russian artist, Vasily Kandinsky, does something kind of radical. He makes art that is non-representational. In other words, up till now, the subjects of art were still found in the natural world. There were abstracted trees and people and moving cars, but the abstracted artworks still represented nameable, recognizable, real-life things. Kandinsky, building upon some Russian artists before him, really departed from the representational. He made works that were lines and squares and triangles and colors. They did not represent or symbolize a tree or a person or anything in the natural world. They were ideas that took visual form. It's not unlike symphonic music. Usually the oboe or flute isn't representing a sound in the natural world. It is the musical manifestation of an idea. It's non-representational. Here's another work by Kandinsky. You can easily identify the form of the work, the design, the colors, the medium is oil paint. But what is the subject? It's an abstract piece. There's no landscape or portrait. The form is the subject. The idea of balance, movement, and shape is the subject itself. So then, what is the content? And that's where the intention of the artist and the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, comes in. In fact, it's Kandinsky who writes in his 1914 book concerning the spiritual in art, every work of art is the child of its age. It's the very first line. Every work of art is the child of its age, and in many cases, the mother of our emotions. It follows that each period of culture produces an art of its own, which can never be repeated. Efforts to revive the art principles of the past will at best produce an art that is stillborn. So, what's going on in the world at this time? In Russia, you've got the rise of Marxism, which doesn't admit religion. According to Karl Marx, religion is the opiate of the masses, right? If you get a lot of poor people to believe in a higher being and an eternal heaven, then they can deal with their earthly exploitation because they'll be rewarded after death. Marx instead insists that communism should focus upon an earthly form of government in which everyone is equally rewarded for their labor. But the Russian working class, still immersed in a serf system, longs for rights to be wronged without an institutional religion to offer a reason why those rights should be wronged. Simultaneously, there's a lot of unrest throughout Europe due to alliances and colonialism that ends up with the beginning of World War I in 1914, which is also the very same year Kandinsky wrote concerning the spiritual in art. So, let's get back to the question. What is the content of this work? When you yearn for stability and peace, but your religious belief is dead and the world is falling apart, you seek a generalized spirituality that satiates your longings. Kandinsky believed that pure form, in its abstract, offered an untainted experience of an unembodied, unhindered spirituality. He also believed colors carried with them emotions and sometimes even sound. Kandinsky assigned specific colors, specific meanings. Red was a violin, restless and glowing with life. Yellow sounded like a trumpet and was cheeky, exciting, disturbing, and even mad, like in the insanity sense. Blue was mournful and supernatural and sounded like a deep, massive pipe organ. White was harmony and silence and so on. So when we look at this work, we can see an explosion of shapes and colors, ultimately supported by a white background. Yes, pigments fade over time, and yes, the background was originally white. There's a sense of hope that holds the social ruptures of the early 1900s, and that's the content. That amidst all the chaos of a world war and of revolutionary ideals that overturn the established political systems and lead to new, unstable governments, there is harmony, hope, and peace. All right, now we're going to review some stuff. First off, there's a Western canon of art that strives to create a larger narrative of Western culture. It's rooted in a Greco-Roman investigation of the natural world. Only the best works that represent the best of Western culture become included in this canon. But remember that there are cultural key holders that determine what gets included in the canon and what does not. And those key holders change over time. Some of the works that were originally incorporated into the canon or the narrative fall to the wayside and are forgotten. Other works that were not formally recognized become part of the canon. The canon is a dynamic, morphing collection of works that is tweaked by ever-changing discussions throughout history. In a way, you can think of the canon as a story told over the course of time by people who use different words, contingent upon their contemporary way of speaking, to communicate the major story. A specific example, Artemisia Gentileschi. It really wasn't until the last 30 years that Gentileschi was able to take her place amongst the Western canon. I mean, obviously, her way of handling paint and the human form fits nicely with the time in which she was producing work, and it's totally representative of the Western canon. But Gentileschi was a woman, and women should be barefoot in the kitchen, not painting like a pro. So it took us about 350 years to realize that maybe women should be admitted into the canon. Even more interesting, Henry O. Tanner, a Black American artist who was active in the late 1800s/early 1900s. John Singer Sargent, a white American contemporary of Tanner's, was super famous during his lifetime, but Tanner still goes underrecognized. Why? Tanner's painting is good. His style is indicative of the portrait painting of his time. John Singer Sargent is in the canon, but why not Tanner? It's no secret. The canon is a little on the racist side. Tanner was Black. He didn't get the commissions and opportunities that John Singer Sargent got during his career because society, and consequently the canon, excluded Tanner on the basis of white supremacy. Only recently are things beginning to change, and it's a super slow change. But at least you're getting an understanding of how the canon is tweaked in the present to fit our current interests and needs. Also, the canon really starts out as a depiction, a representation of the natural world. Early Western art is an illusion of the bodies, plants, lights, perspectives, and three-dimensionality of our world. But by the time photography comes along in the 1840s, artists can deviate from accurate representation because a camera can do that. Instead, artists experiment with their medium and explore the characteristics of oil paint or bronze or whatever it is they're working in. Painters use color to evoke emotions and play with perceptions of light. They begin to challenge the idea that paintings are a window into another world by abstracting natural forms and exploring personal styles and doing bizarre things with perspective. Artists call attention to the fact that the painting itself is just another object in our world. Also, in the 1800s, colonialism, printed materials, and missionary work eventually lead to the rapid collapse of the globe. Cultures become acutely aware of other cultures and other ways of looking at and representing the world through art. Technological advances like the automobile and movie camera become a huge influence in the turn of the century. Artists try to understand these changes through their work. They break away from the traditional way of realistically depicting the world because that tradition seems inadequate and stagnant. It does not take into account the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. And then Russian artists like Vasily Kandinsky completely rupture the tradition by creating non-representational works. So at this point, art is a new game with new, unfamiliar rules.